Hello, welcome to another briefing from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research and Analysis at the Center. Today's briefing is titled The Bitter Harvest of Lebanon's Sectarian Politics, in which we try to shed some light on the ongoing problems of the country and its people. In a nutshell, Lebanon today is suffering from the collapse of an old sectarian compromise that previously worked to secure some rickety accommodation between the different sectarian politicians. Its president, Michel Aoun, has failed to act like an arbiter in the political system as like other previous presidents had done before him. The country is led by a caretaker government headed by Hassan Diab, while a new government has not been able to be formed since last October, since Saad al-Hariri was given the mantle to form the new government. There is a general popular disgust, if I may add, with the political class and the general atmosphere in the country. Popular protests that erupted in October of 2019 have all but disappeared, and sectarian discourse is on the rise. And today, Tripoli, the northern city of Tripoli, is at it again with a lot of protests, especially because of the coronavirus lockdowns. The country's economy is in free fall as the value of the local currency collapses opposite to the dollar, and inflation has soared. Gross domestic product is predicted to decrease by about 20% from 2020, and 2020 had the GDP in 2020 had decreased by 9% from 2019. International lending institutions have stopped lending the country, and both friends and foes have basically given up on lending any money to the country. Poverty levels have reached about 50%, maybe higher, while unemployment has soared. Socially, Lebanese society is suffering from the debilitating impact of paralyzed politics and the collapsed economy. Poverty, unemployment, creeping homelessness, collapse of networks, social networks, and the role of the state, all combined with the impact of the coronavirus pandemic to plainly shut down social activity and possibly social activism. This situation begs many questions, such as what is wrong with Lebanon's politics and whether there are any chances for a breakthrough, and anytime soon. How political paralysis affects the country's economy and development. What conditions of governance have led to the current collapse of the economy? How do the Lebanese people experience the political and economic troubles of the country? What degrees of mobilization and activism are there? And what is necessary to do that, to deal with the coming slide into the abyss? These and other questions will be tackled by a group of specialists who join us today, both from Lebanon and from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they have witnessed the country and its chaos and instability. Each will have about 15 to 20 minutes to present their presentations, and it will be given. Their presentations will be given in this order. Rami Khouri is the Director of Global Engagement at the American University of Beirut, and he will discuss the major political issues at play in the country and how the country has lost its special status in the Arab region. He will be followed by Ali Mbayed, who is an economist and specialist in the MENA region. She will discuss how policy inaction and state capture have aggravated the socio-economic conditions in the country and affected the international response, and what the possible implications may be of the continued political stalemate. Then we will have Mona Harb, who is a professor of urban studies and politics at the American University of Beirut and a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. She will be covering such issues as inequalities and vulnerabilities in Lebanon, the absence of a national social policy, and how all this is instrumentalized by sectarian political actors. A couple of other housekeeping things before we start the webinar. This session will be followed by a Q&A session. Please submit your questions either on the Q&A feature on your screen or by sending your questions to events events@arabcenter.org, events@arabcenter.org. Please identify yourself and direct your question to a specific panelist or to the panel as a whole. I will try to get as many of these questions as possible. And now I turn the floor over to Rami. Rami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Imad, and thank you to the Arab Center for organizing this and for Nabil, his behind-the-scenes work. And I'm delighted to be with Alia and Muna, two scholars and professionals whom I respect very much. And I think the three of us together will provide different angles that will help clarify perhaps what are the trends in Lebanon. My interest is mainly in the relationship between what's going on in Lebanon and what's going on in the wider Arab region. I've lived in Lebanon 3 times in my life, and most recently, just until a few months ago. And it's fascinating that every time I lived there in the late 50s, in the 70s, late 70s, and the last 15 years, there were episodes where American warships were camped in the waters nearby and making gestures about either getting involved in the conflict in the region in Lebanon or threatening to do so, or sanctioning or doing something else. So it's not an accident that you have this history of trends inside Lebanon that are intimately linked to regional trends and global trends. The situation in the most recent period, in the last year and a few months since the uprising started, has been very dramatic, but I think to fully understand it, we need to put it in 2 contexts. One is the historical one for Lebanon, and one is the regional one for what's going on across the Arab region. And historically, I would say it's the uprising that started in October last year until now, and it's still going on, as we can see in outbursts in Tripoli right now this week and other places. The corona and the economic collapse have sent people home mostly, but the drivers of the uprising are still very strong inside people's hearts and minds and pocketbooks, and they're just not sure what to do about it. But right now, there seems to be a low point in public demonstrations, but that will change over time. But so this period from October last year to now is October 19 to now is one time frame. The second one is from 2005 until now, which when the Syrians left Lebanon, or left at least their physical control of the country, and a new variation of the Lebanese sectarian power sharing happened, and we've seen the continuous deterioration over the last 15, 20 years since 2005. The third time frame is really from the mid-70s, late 70s until now. In other words, the last 50 years or so. And that's the period when the gush of oil money in the Arab world, combined with the autocratic regimes, mostly military coups that took power in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Yemen and Sudan, all over the region, when the combination of autocratic indigenous leadership with plenty of oil money created a new ruling power structure that dominated the region. And we can trace some of that back in Lebanon as well from the early 80s until today. Of course, Lebanon also had its civil war, but that combination of local and regional autocracy, militarism, and money was one reason. But the last fourth, and to me the most fascinating context, is really from 1920, 100 years ago, the century of modern Arab statehood, in which for the first 50 years or so, many Arab countries, including Lebanon, after it was created as an independent sovereign state, people's lives improved, broadly speaking, across much of the country. So there was steady improvement, and a middle class emerged, a national identity started to emerge. And you see this all over the region, in Kuwait and Jordan and Libya, and where, you see it in many countries, Syria. And because people's lives were improving, you didn't really have mass uprisings against internal autocrats. And most, it only happened once or twice in Sudan and Iraq, but for different reasons. But the reality is that after the first 50 years of statehood, starting in the mid 70s, early 80s, the last 50 years of statehood have been a stagnation or a downhill continuous trend, leaving us now in a situation which in Lebanon, for the first time, I think, ever in its modern history, Lebanon is no longer a distinctive political system. It was always somehow different from the rest of the Arab world, partly because of its serious pluralism, religious and cultural and political, partly because it was always more open, there was more freedom. And that's why you had, for many, many years, the great universities of Lebanon flourished, the media, publishing, theater, the arts, any activity that required using your full human brain or your full cultural and artistic and creative instincts flourished in Lebanon because people had that space to do so. And as the rest of the region became mostly autocratic, people fled to Lebanon, and so we had this distinctive Lebanese system that was always seen as different from the rest of the Arab world. Well, that's finished now, because what the last few years have shown us, the last, I would say, 15 years, since 2005, is that Lebanon has now become a full-fledged Arab country, in the sense that its population is pauperized and helpless, politically helpless, pauperized economically, and the tragedy of the pauperization and the growth of poverty and inequality is that nobody can give you a precise figure, because the government doesn't have the mechanisms, credible mechanisms, to measure poverty and inequality and marginalization. There's many, many estimates, and the ones I like to use are the ones from the UN, from ESCWA, done by local researchers, which are showing us that um, the trend in Lebanon is getting worse in terms of poverty and inequality. And the reality is that the corona, the uprisings, the regional economic downturn, the drop in oil prices, all of these things, which Ali will talk about more, created a huge hit to the economic situation. And now we have the situation where somewhere between 50 and 70% of the Lebanese population are in poverty or right on the vulnerable edge of poverty. The other thing where Lebanon has become similar to other Arab countries is, as these citizens challenge their state and demand their rights and a decent, dignified life, the state responds with a militarized response. And we saw it in Tripoli a few days ago, and it's still going on and off. So the situation in Lebanon now is one in which the country has joined the rest of the region, but without really being able to come up with a new configuration that makes statehood, citizenship, and sovereignty actually work well. The pattern that we see in Lebanon is repeated all over the region. And in the countries where there are continuing uprisings, Iraq, Sudan, Algeria, and Lebanon, we have almost identical demands by the protest movements. Some of the protesters are more organized than others, but their demands are all the same, which is showing us that this is a regional problem. And it comes out of the same reality, which is that a political elite that was not elected and is not accountable in any meaningful way has treated its people with disdain and has shown the citizens that it doesn't really care about their well-being. So what happened was, if in the last, I would say, 8 or 10 years, the power structure has essentially, the state has essentially told its citizens, we don't care about you, and has detached itself from its citizens. And what's happened in the last year and a half is that the citizens in return have now said to the state, well, we don't want you. We want all of you to leave. And this is quite an extraordinary situation where the state and the citizenry don't want each other, but they don't know how to come up with a better situation, and therefore we're likely to see a continuation of economic stagnation, political pressure, and other problems. Um, the the important thing I think to keep in mind also is the role of international intervention and regional intervention. The presence of international actors has been in the country since the mid-19th century. It's nothing new, and it continues to take place, and maybe is expanding now with signs of Turkish engagement in parts of Lebanon. Iran, of course, is in Lebanon in a big way through Hezbollah and other groups. The Saudis have long tried to be involved through the Sunnis, and Syrians, of course, were in and out, and they're still involved behind the scenes. So you have this incredible legacy of regional and international direct intervention, including military intervention, and not to mention, of course, the Israelis who've constantly been using Lebanon for their own purposes and have, attacked it and occupied it, etc. So this continuing trend of international direct military and political intervention, whether through sanctions or occupation or threats or whatever it may be, is one that continues and is also a hallmark of the region. The Syrian war made this very clear that it was acceptable for regional powers like, say, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Iranians, the Turks. A regional power can combine with a local power. The local power could be an NGO or a militia or a political movement, and combine with a superpower. So in Syria, you had the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, local groups were all fighting at the Turks. They were all involved fighting each other in Syria. And that has now become a common regional kind of hallmark, a mechanism whereby people get involved in Yemen, in Libya, possibly again in Somalia in places, and in Lebanon, and who knows where else this is going to happen. So this regional intervention, military and political intervention, is also a new element at the large scale that it's happening. There was always foreign intervention in Lebanon, but it was usually somebody paying off a newspaper to speak for it, somebody helping a political group. Now it's much more at the level of big movements. And of course, the result of this now is that, in my view, there are only two political actors in Lebanon today. The first, of course, is Hezbollah, which is a gigantic force in the country. Not always openly discussed, but it's there. People understand its power. The other force is the people protesting, the protesting citizens, who have not figured out yet how to bring about the changes they want, but they're going to keep exploring ways to do it, including getting involved in elections next year and other possibilities. But the stalemate that exists now, with the political order that is pretty clear in its inability and unwillingness to fix the problems of the country or to make any serious reforms, even when you have people like the French president coming in, the World Bank, IMF, people saying, we've got $10 billion to help you. Even with that, the political order isn't going to make any changes. And the citizens are not going to stop protesting. They can't all immigrate. They can't all rely on savings. So there's a terrible stalemate, which is going to have to be resolved somehow in the coming year or two, but nobody knows how. The fascinating thing to me is how closely the conditions in Lebanon, the attitudes of both the power elite and the citizenry reflect what's going on across the whole region. Um, the latest Arab Opinion Index put out by the Arab Center in Doha in Washington uh, shows us trends around the region which are almost exactly mirrored in public opinion trends in Lebanon, which is about 70% of household income is not sufficient to cover basic needs. About 20 to 25% of people want to immigrate. 30% of people in the 18 to 34-year-old group want to immigrate, which is the most dynamic group in society. 90% and over see corruption as a main problem in their country. 60 to 80% see the uprisings as something that's good and they support it. So these trends are regional trends and they're exactly mirrored in Lebanon now. And that to me is quite striking. How the political protesters react to the stalemate that they're in now remains to be seen. There's many discussions going on, which Alia and Muna will know a lot about. They're there, and they can perhaps clarify this. Nobody knows how this is going to be resolved. And with that, I will stop my comments and turn it over to the next speaker, hoping that we can get some clarity on these issues.
Thank you, Rami, very much. We appreciate it. This is a really all-encompassing and wide-angle look at Lebanese political and regional problems. Today, now, Alia, please tell us about how the economic situation is going.
Thank you, Imad, and thank you for the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. for inviting me again. And I would like to maybe build a little bit on what Rami has said, not necessarily to go again and explain how historically this interplay between fractious politics based on sectarianism and the widespread clientelism that weakened state institutions and that married with some sort of crony capitalism led to an extremely weakening state institutions. And this interplay between these factors are, in my view, even as an economist, are at the core center of the current crisis and I would say multifaceted crisis that Lebanon is grappling with. I will not try to explain that in details. I think even when I was with you in August, we spoke about this at length, but I would like to focus on three key issues today. The first one is really reflect on how the interplay of these factors since last year have contributed to both the aggravation of the economic, financial, and social crisis, threatening basically increasingly the national security of Lebanon. Then I would like to maybe speak very briefly about the deterioration of these economic indicators and some of the trends, both positives and negatives, that we are seeing emerge as a result of this morphing economic crisis. And then maybe try to throw some ideas on how should we think about the outlook for the economy, given both this domestic socio-political landscape, but also the changing regional, both geopolitical and geoeconomic setup. So on the first point, I think, in my view, and I have been here in Lebanon for at least, I could say very easily over the last year, closely associated with the development of the financial crisis. I can confirm that the combination of first incompetence and policy inaction by those in charge of economic policies on the one hand, but also the coming to fore of how strong state capture is in Lebanon by warlords and their associated basically business elites, have played a fundamental role in not only in preventing any solution for the crisis, but actually aggravating its fallout, particularly on the middle class and the society at large. How is this? Very quickly, I think we all remember when the crisis started unfolding at the end of 2019, and by no means this is a crisis that was that doesn't date too many years before. We've been talking about it very clearly, very at length for years. But as it erupted, I think, and the new government came into place, we have clearly seen first the past government inability to deal with the unraveling of the crisis, but also the new government that came into place was at a loss on how to deal with it. Not only were they not aware of the size of the crisis, its implication, and how to go about it, but I think more importantly, as we went into the policy decisions that the Diab government has taken, we have seen the rise of increasing role of political elites in as they started understanding the implication of the collapse of the banking sector and the default on the debt and its implication on the losses both in the banking sector but also on the sovereign balance sheet of the state, and how the distribution of the losses will invariably change the economic power balance within the system. Then we started seeing basically these business elites and their associated political class attempt at thwarting any basically evidence-based policy approach to solving the financial crisis, which many local and internationally based Lebanese economists have tried to put forward and support the policy debate about it. So there was this and the culmination of this was really when the Association of Banks, which represents the interest of owners of the banks, entered into collision with the government on the proposed government plan and even affected the past words and engagements that was starkly building with the IMF towards an exit from the crisis. So. But I think the culmination of the policy inaction and incompetence came into play more forcefully with the unfortunate explosion of August 4, which basically not only has shown an inability of the state because of what the explosion unraveled in terms of corruption at the port and how it was managed, and the fact that there has still no accountability on this development, which also has economic implication because it's not allowing a lot of the institutions, and particularly in the private sector and in and households affected by the crisis, to claim it from the insurance sort of the premiums that would allow them to move ahead. But I think the culmination also was that until now we have seen an inability of Lebanon to build, but also I would say to squander the opportunity of capitalizing on the international goodwill that the international community has shown after the blast, for providing both humanitarian assistance, but also maybe helping in devising a broader recovery plan, which I'm sure Mona will touch upon. But I think this combination of incompetence, policy inaction, we have seen it over the last year quite forcefully, and has, of course, very dangerous implication, I would say, because it has deepened the mistrust and the lack of trust by the citizens in the ability of the state to take charge of them. And I think, as Rami said, not only what he quoted in terms of loss of face by the index he quoted, but I think also a very interesting new survey done by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung across all transition countries, or 10 years after the Arab Spring, shows that Lebanon has one of the lowest level of its citizens' trust in both government, parliament, and political parties. So I think the fallout from this policy inaction, incompetence throughout the management of the crisis, let alone, and I'm not going to go into that, how the COVID-related response to the COVID crisis was managed, just aggravated these elements. Now, moving to my second point quickly is that the deterioration. So from that point, I see the deterioration in the socioeconomic situation, particularly since last October, a direct result of these failure of governance, but also of incompetence and policy inaction. And we have seen that by the inability to move ahead with a comprehensive approach to dealing with the debt and financial sector, debt restructuring, financial sector collapse that really led to a severe contraction in GDP. I think you mentioned 9%, but I think 2020, the latest numbers that we have is that the contraction of GDP in real terms can actually even more than 30%. So your GDP has gone from 50 billion to around 18 billion. And if you even, that is if you count, adjust for the deterioration in the exchange rate, but that has serious implication on per capita income, and then of course on the basically on the broader economic indicators, particularly because this contraction in activity also led to quite a widespread shedding of labor across all the sector, which, coupled with hyperinflation, I mean, food prices during 2020 increased by 400%. This is only food prices. We are at more than 130% hyperinflation today. The erosion of savings also in the banks through this process of socializing the losses, as opposed to embracing a structured approach with the help of the IMF and the international community, is de facto basically resulting in a 70% haircut on people saving more than $120 billion of deposits in the banks that are basically left many savings, particularly of retirees in key sectors like in education and teachers, doctors, really reduced their savings to nothing. But I think also the migration flow, and as we talk about the trends, the loss of skill and the exodus of talent is what is very dangerous today, particularly also the talent that is most needed during the COVID crisis, the talent of doctors and nurses, but also professionals seeking opportunities elsewhere. Whether this will be a transient thing or not remains to be seen, and much will depend on where the outlook of the country will be. But when we think that the loss of human capital at a time where the country needs it the most will aggravate, I would say, the loss of capital that we are seeing through the collapse of the banking sector, then we are just adding fuel to the fire. But I think I don't only want to sound very negative, but I want to just maybe look at the trends that I think in the short to medium term will continue to be with us on the economic front. I think, as I mentioned, I think we still see something to hang on to and build on for a positive solution in the short to medium term. And in my view, these are the following. The first one is the incredible amount of social solidarity that I would maybe call the informal safety nets that have left basically the country and society, I would say, or the amount of destruction less severe than you could have seen looking at the scale of the crisis and the losses. I think whether the flow of remittances that is still coming despite the problems with the banking sector, or the solidarity that we have seen post the Beirut explosions, are important positives to build upon, and I'm sure Mona will touch upon that. But I think also there is another side to this solidarity which has serious political implication, which is the consolidation of informal networks of the existing political elites, which constitute increasingly a way for lessening, I would say, the anger and holding them accountable in the future for the catastrophe that is befalling the economy and the pauperization of people. So we are seeing an extreme widening of distribution of of subsidized, basically debit card that are related to some political parties, or basic goods being distributed, particularly during the winter. And these informal safety net will leave their marks on how the political dynamics will move down the line. But the second positive factor, I would say, is the private sector, the Lebanese private sector, trying to seek opportunities out of the collapse. I think what we have seen is that with the sharp deterioration and devaluation in the currency, even though in the unofficially in parallel markets, I think it gives opportunity for some private sector to invest in industries that are either import substituting, or has boosted some companies that have export potential. It is still very small and very nascent, frankly, compared to the broader crisis. But I think this is a green shoot that is important to build upon and support. But I think also the positive is this increased demand for better governance of public policy, and I think, and particularly economic policy in the future. I think the demand that we are seeing, both from some voices, I would say, in the banking sector, there are only few of them, and we hope they get stronger and wider in scope, but also in a more engaged and socially responsible private sector, and of course through the forces of change of the October 17 movement, there is a broad demand and agreement that a new mode of economic governance need to be instated. But I think the negative trends that we have to all work towards limiting is, as we said, the rapid popularization through a comprehensive approach to solving the crisis. The negative other trend is the thriving cash economy with our porous borders, particularly with Syria, which is helping continue the hemorrhage of little available dollar liquidity that Lebanon has across the border because of the mismanagement of subsidy rationalization, notably of that of the fuel, and the thriving cash economy, which will be very difficult to reverse in the future. That's a negative trend that we are seeing. But also, I think the broader isolation of Lebanon from the global and regional sphere of development finance is, for me, also a very worrying trend. Notwithstanding the support that we have seen or willingness of support from the international community and the international support group, first before the August 4 blast, but also after it. But in real terms, we have seen very little disbursements of the development finance to Lebanon over the past eight months, not more than 300 million in a time where Lebanon needs annually $7 to $8 billion. So this isolation, which is also due to the geopolitical factors and the domestic political stalemate, has severe implication on cutting Lebanon from development finance. And finally, I mean, if we look in the future, I think it is extremely difficult for me to see how we can exit without remembering that after a year, the Lebanese themselves, through this combination of incompetence and state capture, have managed to aggravate the sizes of the losses. We started last year with, at the beginning of the year, with maybe a 50 billion loss or negative equity position at the central bank. Now it's probably bigger by at least 10 billion in my estimate. We are also, after a year, much more prized landscape in terms of the policy, economic policy choices, because of our inability to agree on the financial sector restructuring and the debt restructuring and on the distribution of these losses. We are in a weaker state because of our inability to develop a fiscal policy plans that addresses the public finances. So as we look into the willingness of the international community with the new US administration, and we have seen President Macron willing to revive his French initiative, in my view, I see it difficult to move ahead with this initiative without reviewing at least three issues. One,
Ali, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you wrap it up, please, a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you.
So anchor this French initiative within the need for political reform to address these failures of governance. Second, insist as part of this initiative on regaining the capacity of state institutions to develop and implement sound economic policies within a comprehensive framework. And three, last but not least, establish constructive engagement with the international community, and notably through an IMF program, in order to mobilize development finance for a new growth and finance model for Lebanon.
Thank you, Alia. We appreciate it. Thanks very much. Appreciate your this is truly another comprehensive look at a whole bunch of things. I hope that the question and answer period will be also another opportunity to also hash out some of these questions. Mona, your turn.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're signing in from. Thank you very much for this generous invitation to the Arab Center. It's a pleasure really to be here. My talk is going to very much build on what Rami and Alia have said, and it will be complementary to many of the ideas they raised. I want to mainly talk about three things. First is and I won't be long with that because they've shared with us a lot on the issues of inequalities and vulnerabilities. So I will go quickly over that point. I want to focus on the absence of a social policy at the national level that would help Lebanese people go through those multiple crises they're experiencing and living. And I want to showcase what this type of public policy making does on the ground by featuring the case of the management of the pandemic, more specifically the territorial management of the pandemic. So speaking about this from, I would say, a spatial perspective. And I will close with a note on a reflective note on oppositional politics and the importance of organizing, I would say. So as Rami and Alia specifically demonstrated, the governance system in Lebanon, the political and economic governance system in Lebanon is structured fundamentally, I would say, in unjust and unequal ways. And this system of governance have benefited a very small group of people and their networks at the expense of the majority, and that this unequal system have manufactured vulnerabilities that are deeply embedded in our social and spatial fabric, and that are being aggravated. I use again the verb that Alia highlighted, because it's not that they've been born yesterday, but that they've been in the making for decades, and one could also go into history to find their deep roots. So all these vulnerabilities are manufactured and are aggravated by the multiple crises we're living, including the recent August 4th blast. So we have numbers on this inequality. The latest have been published by Lydia Aswad in her study in 2018, and she shows how the income in Lebanon is extremely concentrated, with the top 1% and 10% of the adult population receiving 25% and 55% of national income on the average. So this places Lebanon among the countries with the highest level of income inequality in the world, and that was even before the devaluation of the Lebanese pound and the collapses we're living that will certainly skew these figures even further. These figures also reveal how the dynamism of the economic sectors that were also always the flagship sectors of Lebanon, banking, tourism, real estate, have benefited only this minority of the population, and the largest part of the population actually lives in extreme poverty and in poverty. So there's a recent report that was published by IFI, building on Oxfam and the FI data, that places these, that gives us a bit more of these figures and places the number of unemployed people in Lebanon. And it says that this number has doubled just over the past 2 years, and that today we have more than 20% of the workforce that is unemployed, and an increasing number of people who are also worried about having enough food to eat. Estimates from ESQA say that 55% of the population is trapped in poverty and is struggling to meet bare necessities. And I won't say much more about this. I think it was covered largely. I just want to make sure that we understand vulnerability in its multiple heterogeneities. So this involves a variety of groups who are more vulnerable than others, including female-headed households. We have a lot of those in cities, migrants, refugees, tenants on old rent, even tenants on new rent now with the devaluation, and people with disabilities, among others. So facing all these humongous challenges, public policies addressing such challenges are, not to use a different qualifier, pretty much minimalist. And they do not address the root causes of these issues because they're made by the people who produce these inequalities and manufactures these vulnerabilities. I think Alia explained this very well. I could have made a presentation on urban policies and taken the case study of the reconstruction after the blast to tell you how the reconstruction process and that reconstruction policy is mismanaged, how there's a small unit of the army piloting it, a flagrant absence of the municipality and other planning agents, a domination of UN bodies and international organizations and NGOs. But I was asked to focus on the social dimensions instead, and I will use works of my colleagues to do that, but I'll be very happy to get back to issues related to urban policy and reconstruction if there are any questions around that. So at the level of social protection and social policy, a study published in 2019 tells us that merely 45% of Lebanese residents, actually 45% of Lebanese residents do not have access to social protection. We have developed at the national level a national social protection system, mainly based on targeted cash transfers, and these are being given to a group of 43,000 households. And this program has been critiqued by a number of policymakers and scholars because its eligibility criteria was unclear and the distribution packages that occurred were unfair. And mostly it was critiqued because it's short-sighted, given it does not address the root causes of this poverty and inequalities. So on the contrary, it contributes to create what Lea Bukhater calls a dynamic of exclusion, whereby the upper and middle classes are relatively protected through a subsidized private sector that ensures this protection, whereas state employees are relatively provided for by the state, albeit in limited quality and quantity, and informal workers and self-employed and the unemployed are unprotected. So instead of privileging addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality that are linked to the dysfunctional and unproductive economic model we have been investing in, and to develop efficient progressive taxation system and mechanisms, again, building on what Alia was saying, that would have financed a universal social protection scheme in Lebanon, we privilege short-sighted policies that just kick the can like we do in an array of other policy sectors. What this does really is increase dependency on sectarian patrons, and it also facilitates the reproduction of this oligarchic political system. And in a recent research project I've been developing in the Beirut Urban Lab, where I do my research alongside Ahmed Gharbiye and Mona Fawaz, we have been studying the management of the pandemic by the Lebanese government and variety of stakeholders. And we've seen how this management of the pandemic does exactly that, reproduce the sectarian system. So the pandemic, as elsewhere, I mean, this has been an opportunity for authoritarian regimes and even democratic systems all over the globe. The pandemic was very much used in Lebanon as an opportunity to strengthen the grip of sectarian actors, but also of the army and of the militarization process Rami mentioned on the ground. So in our project, we documented the actions of sectarian political actors, as well as in other institutional actors such as religious groups and international organizations. And we also documented the actions of civil society groups and grassroots initiatives. So we did that from the period of March till August 2020, just before the blast. Actually, the blast made us stop this project, and we documented around 538 entries. And since the blast, we stopped working on this project because the plight of the aggravated crisis we're living make us really feel that the pandemic is put in a relative perspective. So working on this data set, we've identified two broad categories of actors' response, which we categorize as top-down actors and bottom-up actors. Top-down are the political and religious actors, government actors, international organizations, and the bottom-up are more the NGOs, INGOs, collectives and campaigns, as well as university and professional actors. And our main, I would say, quantitative finding is that 2/3 of the pandemic's response in Lebanon is dominated by sectarian political parties and religious groups and government actors, while 1/3 of the response is distributed among a variety of other actors. So our work really highlights two sets of findings, and I'm going to share with you the maps that we've produced. On that, so that's the first map that you get to see, which highlights the dominance of sectarian political groups, which are coded according to their political logos and signs. So you see how over the whole national territory, sectarian actors have made sure to regain their place in the territory through providing responses to the pandemic through a variety of actions actually that we identified, ranging from aid and relief to medical services to quarantine centers to even policing and providing implementing preventive measures. So the second map I'd like to show you is one where we document both the top-down actors' response and the bottom-up actor responses, where you see the 2/3, 1/3 proportion I mentioned earlier, and you see how the COVID-19 response in Lebanon reveals what we're calling contested territorialities by actors who are less ideological than the dominant groups. So if we look at the data, we see that there are various modalities of governance, and these reproduce what we're calling multiple and contested territories that intersect together, coexist, reconfigure dominant political geographies in some places, especially in cities. And it shows that we do have a dominant political order that is sectarian, but it is challenged by spaces of growing mutual aid and solidarity that were mentioned by my colleagues earlier. A third map, just for the pleasure of looking at nice maps that were developed by our visualization team under the direction of Ahmad Gharbiye, is this that shows us again the variation of the responses across Qada and Muhafaza, where you see the hybridity of responses across Mount Lebanon, South Lebanon, North Beirut, etc. So this is an ongoing project which we hope to publish soon. So these are not yet public maps, but this is sort of a scoop presentation that gives you an idea about how the governance of this pandemic informs us also on about the situation we're living of a particular, I would say, policy sector, health policy and social policy in this relation. Now, I want to focus in my last point on these spaces of solidarity, which are very much linked to spaces of oppositional politics. So this is not new in Lebanon. We have been, okay, electricity cut at 6 p.m. in Beirut. I think people who are familiar with our electricity system, that's an echo to our great infrastructure. Okay, so continuing my point, I was talking about oppositional politics and the fact that people in Lebanon have been protesting the systemic inequalities and the oppressive political system since decades, and we can go back again to history to inform us about this. But let's focus a little bit on what happened on October 2019 and the fact that these protests are still occurring just last week we had protests and we lost Alia too for electricity. So she's going to sign in again. It's 6 p.m. all across Beirut. So, so these protests will continue, but continued since October 2019, but they varied enormously in their geographies, and they became less intense, less frequent, more fragmented and dispersed, although they didn't totally stop. So this growth of oppositional mobilization and oppositional politics have been consolidating in very strong ways, I would say, since 2009, and they have been coalescing, and I will highlight this verb, since at various points of time. So we saw that in 2015 with the garbage protest, the Youth Think movement. We saw this again in 2016 with the mobilization in the municipal elections and the Beirut Madinati experiment. We saw it again in 2018 with the mobilization to participate in national elections and the Tahaluf Watani coalition, up to October 2019, where we saw a very different landscape of uprising that people qualified as a revolution, where the decentralization of actions on the ground was noteworthy. All cities and towns were talking to each other and singing to each other their slogans. There was spatial appropriation of key sites, buildings, and infrastructures all around. The nature of the discontent changed. That was the famous slogan of Kullun Yani Kullun, that encompassed all leaders and groups of the political spectrum and was quite revolutionary. There was public defamation of public actors and politicians that were afraid of going out in public without being defamed. The nature of the crowd was quite different and included a lot of women groups, of feminist groups, of LGBTQ groups. They were very strongly linked to professional groups, and syndicates movements started to re-emerge. Independent syndicate movements tried to reorganize. Even people left the ranks of their sectarian parties to join the uprising. So we should not underestimate that moment, because it is very much indicative of a profound change that Rami alluded to in his talk, that we need to keep remembering, because it is continuing also in less visible forms. So these opposition groups, I'm not romanticizing them at all. They have been also largely critiqued because they're not coordinated enough, they're not organized enough. They have ineffective leadership because they privilege more horizontal forms of leadership over the traditional structures of political parties. They are dominated by professional middle class. They're disconnected from grassroots. They have weak political visions and programs. All this has been well documented in various reports and writings. They are also operated by activists who are volunteers, so who volunteer their time and labor after hours, which is obviously unsustainable for the upkeep of such mobilization. There have been also, and I really want to highlight this point, because we always critique these opposition groups for their internal problems, but we often forget to highlight the fact that they have been very violently repressed and suppressed by the state, by state militarization and by the army. And there has been a huge increase in the modes of control against protesters. They've been injured seriously. There have been deaths, and these have been also documented by Human Rights Watch reports very regularly. So we are in conditions where organizing is extremely difficult to upkeep and to maintain. However, opposition platforms have been continuing to do so, and they have been trying to develop institutionally, programmatically, politically, and I can mention a few groups as examples of that, such as Muwatinun Muwatinat fi Dawla, the National Bloc, Li Haqqi, and others. Professional unions have been also trying to mobilize along independent secular lines, and maybe the most successful attempts to mobilization are found among students groups, secular students groups who have mobilized in the recent months, and they won elections in private universities, which sent a very interesting signal on the ground. Also, the mobilization of a young young groups of diaspora is very remarkable, and their role in supporting the recovery works after the blast, gathering millions of dollars and adopting modalities of operation and distribution of these funds that are accountable and transparent also is noteworthy to think of among the multiple mobilization networks that have been put in place over the past decade and are continuing to grow and strengthen and to solidify. So this really demonstrates an impressive capacity at organizing in Lebanon, at working collaboratively, at imagining a more inclusive and just society and polity, one that puts people at the center of its work. So the journey for political change is, of course, very, very long. It's laborious, but we also need to see that the building blocks are getting organized very slowly. There are a lot of ebbs and flows. There are a lot of mistakes and shortcomings, but even if this organizing seems almost inconsequential amidst the really huge pains that we're living and that are created by the multiple crises Lebanese are living, this organizing matters and it hasn't stopped. I will stop on that note, and thank you for your attention and look forward to engaging more with you over Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. We appreciate it. Very nice. I like it when you included all those groups that are involved in protests and in the grassroots organizations that are hopefully, in my opinion, they present Lebanon with a very nice alternative to what's going on today. We have quite a few questions. I'd like to start with basically in the order in which you spoke. So we'll start with Rami. Rami, we have a question for you from our Khalil Jahshan. He's wondering, does the hesitation by Arab states to come to Lebanon's rescue at this time stem from the same general lack of trust by the international community and the Lebanese elite and its mismanagement of the economic and political system? Or are there uniquely Arab concerns to justify this regional hesitance?
The answer to that is I don't really know, but it's a great question. And you should create a study group to figure it out. That's Khalil's job. But my reaction to that is that, again, we've got to look at Lebanon in the broader Arab context. Something started in the 1980s in the Arab world or the Arab region, which was the initial collapse of the integrity of the state of Somalia in the 1980s. And this has now spread to other countries. So we had countries that started to collapse internally. And then what happened was the international order, back then in the 80s, it was the Soviets and the American-led blocs, basically gave up on these countries. They became disposable countries. And we've had now a series of disposable or disposable Arab countries. Libya was one, Yemen was one, Iraq in a strange way, even Syria in a strange way. They're not dispensable, but the international political order dealt with them only in terms of the other countries' self-interest. So the Turks would go into Syria because something was important for them. The Iranians, the Israelis, whatever. These countries don't matter very much to the global strategic and security situation. Lebanon particularly doesn't matter very much because it's a very small place. But the strategic issues in Lebanon, again, I think relate essentially to Hezbollah, which means Iran and Syria, or the resistance front, as it's called. So when Arab countries are slow to come in to help Lebanon, I think it probably means Lebanon is not that important to them anymore. They have the strategic interests and the national development priorities, or in some cases, the national survival priorities of different Arab countries have radically changed today from what they were 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. I remember Lebanon in the 1960s when I was in college, and the extraordinary regional intervention, mostly through the media and political groups and stuff like that. That doesn't happen very much anymore. So that's my gut reaction, that the Arab countries have more important issues to deal with. If you look at the Emirates and the Saudis, but particularly the Emirates, what they're trying to do in the Horn of Africa and North Africa, getting involved in the war in Libya, setting up military and port bases, it's quite extraordinary. So Lebanon is really a peripheral country now. And we see it in the international community's reaction over the last year and a half or 2 years. The country keeps deteriorating. People suffer. There's terrible human suffering. And the world says, we're ready to help you if you reform, but the political system in Lebanon doesn't want to reform. Therefore, the world says, well, I'm sorry, we can't do anything. And this is a terrible situation because it does suggest that one option in the final outcome is a Somalia option where the government collapses and you end up with tribal fiefdoms. The reason that's not likely to happen, though, is again, I get back to Hezbollah. Hezbollah cannot allow Lebanon to become Somalia, nor does Hezbollah want to run Lebanon, which it can take it over. In theory, it's strong enough, but it doesn't want to do that for many different reasons. And so the real future of a peaceful, equitable, dignified Lebanon needs resolving the conflict between Iran and the Arab countries and Israel, and resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Both of those are doable, but they're not going to get done very soon. So I would imagine that we're going to live with this situation of uncertainty for quite a while. And Arab countries will come into Lebanon only when it gives them a direct strategic interest in doing so. And those reasons are very, very few now.
Well, thanks, Rami, for this very bright and really happy answer. No, I understand. And it's really a very difficult situation, and you might be right that Lebanon may have lost its brightness, so to speak, for the Arab countries or for the international community. Thank you very much. Alia, I have quite a few questions. First of all, you have talked a lot about basically, I mean, your presentation was about the economic collapse and the economic problems, but still there is a question from Jenny Silver, who basically asked what happened in 2005, since 2005, that caused the downfall spiral into poverty. In other words, I mean, this has been a gradual process. I mean, what exactly happened to people? Another question is, I don't know if you are equipped to do this, but you probably are, because you are equipped to do a whole bunch of things. What is the impact of the immigration of skilled professionals during the financial crisis? What's the impact of that on the COVID-19 crisis and how to manage that? So please go ahead.
Thank you, Imad. No, absolutely. I think the problems of Lebanon are structural, and the deterioration has been ongoing, at least both from the macro level, in a very flagrant manner, I would say, since the 2010, 2011. I think if you look at periods where the popularization was a bit limited, is because this was due to exactly these financing model that allowed a lot of Lebanese to benefit from very high interest rates in the banking system, and in a very obscure manner, and not understanding that the Ponzi scheme was building up, and they were living on this sort of fallacy of a bright and smart financier running the show, without really looking at the underlying socioeconomic drivers that were weakening over time, whether through an erosion of the potential of growth, because actually since the 2005, as you rightly said, we have seen very little growth in investment, at least productive investment, or investment that was job creating, but rather went into more sort of a non-tradable rent-seeking sector. But at the same time, I think also waves of migration, and that goes to the second question, have reduced the social impact of the crisis, because let's remember that at least between 2005 2008 there was a lot of opportunities, at least before the financial crisis, for Lebanese to go and work in abroad, whether in the region and globally, and keep basically sending remittances. And it's really after 2010 that these remittances, because of the widening structural imbalances, were becoming increasingly not enough, and led to the buildup of debt and the unraveling of the financial crisis. And as much as the exodus of talent has been, or relying on immigration on Lebanon has been a way to dampen the impact of mismanaged economic policies since last few decades, through $7 to $8 billion of remittances being sent. But I think today these exodus of talent has become increasingly a liability. And on the question of COVID, I think the numbers, we don't have accurate numbers, but some people say that in the thousands we've lost doctors and nurses over the last few months. But I think what is more critical is not only the human capital, but it's also putting a sector that was known to be one of the most important exporter of services, at least in the region, putting it under severe strain because of this inability of managing the tension between keeping the economy going and then managing the necessity of having lockdowns to contain the COVID. So the emigration has added to this inability to manage. And maybe last thing to say, because there's a question related to that. I mean, when I say incompetence in general, I'm not saying that people necessarily don't know, are not qualified to do things. I mean, even people who have been put into positions over the last year were successful in the private sector or in academia. But I think the business of dealing with a crisis, but also public sector management and managing a state institution is not something that you can learn as an afterthought or on the spot. I think to go back to the subject of this session, which is sectarianism and poor governance, and that respond to one question on Masraf Lebanon or on the Banque du Liban, is that we have seen a systematic, basically, I would say push back against the professionalization of the civil service in Lebanon. A civil service that is based on merit, on competence, and that has built its experience from the bottom up within the public sector through achievements and performance and delivery of services. And I think the fact that we shunned away from rewarding those who have been working in the civil service along non-sectarian, non-clientelist parameters, but on the contrary, we have penalized them for not adhering to these clientelist have undermined the ability of the state to deliver the services, particularly in the social sector, but also have reduced considerably the framework for and the quality of policy formulation, execution, and evaluation within the public sector. And what we are seeing today is just a direct result of that.
Thank you very much. I must apologize. That question about the COVID, the exodus of professionals was from Elizabeth Ouaidat. Now, a question from me to Mona, and you actually tried to bait everybody, and you baited me. Please tell us about the reconstruction after the reconstruction process that you alluded to after the August 4th explosion at Beirut port.
Yes, so the reconstruction process is currently mismanaged and miscoordinated. It's mainly led by, it wants to be led, actually. It's trying to be led by Army unit, the Forward Emergency Room that's located, that took office in the municipality of Beirut, and that is trying to coordinate the response action of NGOs on the ground. So they have defined a perimeter of action in conjunction with OCHA, the organization that coordinates the work of the UN agencies, UNDP, UNHCR, and UN Habitat, among others. And they have distributed certain sectors to NGOs, trying to coordinate the action and to reduce duplication and overlaps and enhance coordination among all these actors. So they've created this dashboard and they've created this system through which NGOs should come and register and commit to repairing a number of units that are of a certain level of destruction. So they're only repairing the units that can be repaired. So what we call level 1 and level 2, the most hurt by the explosion, level 3 that have structural damage, have been earmarked for interventions that are more costly, and they are still standing as they are under very poor structural conditions in the neighborhoods affected by the blast. So on the ground, what we have is people, residents, businesses who don't know about the process of repair, because this process of repair was not well conceived and well communicated to them. So depending on their networks and who they know and friends of friends or friends or of their children, they would be able to access certain NGOs to be able to know how to get support and repair their homes or their businesses. And there is a majority of people who are left out from the process, which is extremely slow. And a lot of people have had to resort to their own means to repair. So those with means are better off than those without means. Those who manage to fill the survey that was distributed by the army to provide compensation received some funds in Lebanese pounds. Some people received much more funds than others. So on the ground, it's a very messy situation where you have a very high heterogeneity of situations. There's no vision guiding the response. There's no strategic plan guiding the response. The blast has not been used as a potential opportunity to rethink urban policy and planning in these parts of Beirut that have been gentrified over the past years, where a lot of people have been evicted as well, and where there's a real danger of population displacement and of ending up with ghost neighborhoods where very few people live because it's not livable anymore. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, thanks very much. This is a question to Rami from Marcus Montgomery, who basically asks, you noted the widespread political influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon. What would you say to those in Washington who demand Lebanon root out Hezbollah if Beirut wants financial and other support from the United States and the international funding institutions?
Well, if we lived in a world where consistency and morality actually mattered, we would tell the United States government, you negotiated with the Taliban, you negotiated with the Viet Cong, people who were killing you, you can sit and talk to Hezbollah. They're not directly killing Americans. But of course, we don't live in a normal world. We live in a world of political hypocrisy and double standards, which are universal, to be fair, not just the American government. But the American government has taken this attitude, and it's not just Trump. This goes back for years, where essentially they view the world as markets or targets. It's either a market that you exploit commercially, or they're targets that you bomb and sanction and threaten. And the most common expression on the lexicon of American politics in the Middle East is probably nothing is off the table. In other words, military force, sanctions, whatever. The United States attitude to Hezbollah is essentially driven by Israeli and pro-Israeli forces in Washington. And this has been the situation for many, many years. The advent of the Biden administration remains to be seen, but the tradition of centrist Democrats like Biden and Blinken and others is not very encouraging for people in the Arab countries because the tradition of the centrist Democrats, which they've shown towards Hezbollah and other issues, Palestine issue particularly, is that the Israelis have more rights than Arabs, that military force is the main instrument of diplomacy, and that Arab ordinary people have no rights, not just in Lebanon or Palestine, but across the region. And of course, this goes back to 1920. Again, we've got it, this century perspective is critical. If you go back and look at the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandates, the Arab people don't exist. They're invisible people. They're actors. They're like cartoon figures, but they don't exist as people with rights. And it's been that way for a century. Trump's administration brought this to an extreme level of cruelty with what they were doing in Palestine and other places. But the issue of Hezbollah is an issue that reflects the collapse of the Lebanese state, the inability of the Lebanese state historically to take care of its people, which was one reason why Hezbollah was born, in terms of internal social equity and in terms of Israeli occupation and harassment of the south of Lebanon. Hezbollah came up in the early 1980s. Before the early 1980s, there was no Hezbollah. So these are movements that, Hamas is similar. These are movements that play multiple roles. One of them is military resistance to Zionist threats and Western imperialism, as they call it. One of them is social equity within their countries. And one of them is just simply trying to live a normal life and not be attacked and threatened and sanctioned by foreign powers, whether in the region or internationally. There's many, many dimensions to a group like Hezbollah. Some of them may be good, some of them are not good. But the answer to a group like Hezbollah is they have legitimacy in their country, not with all Lebanese, but with many Lebanese. And they have legitimacy among many people in the region. You can't ignore them. So if you can't ignore the Taliban and you can't ignore the Viet Cong, by all means, you shouldn't ignore Hezbollah and just try to threaten it and sanction it, but try to engage politically in a manner that ultimately leads you back to the core reasons why Hezbollah was born. And these are tough issues, as we've heard today. These are not issues that are going to be resolved soon. Social equity, social justice, economic opportunity, inequality, pauperization, social protection. These are, and just voice. And even now when Lebanese try to, and not just Lebanese, again, I go back to my first point, all over the region, Iraq, Sudan, Lebanon, and Algeria, and Jordan sometimes, and some other places occasionally. When people go out into the streets, they increasingly are met with a militarized battalion. It's quite extraordinary. This is a common problem. So even the voice of people to speak out is increasingly difficult for many Arab citizens, and we see it Lebanon with the protests. The answer, these are political issues that have social and economic roots, and they can only be ultimately addressed by going and tackling those issues in a political process, which is not easy to do. Right now in Lebanon, the political elite doesn't want to do political reform, doesn't want to engage in a dialogue. The political elite gave a few concessions at the beginning of the uprising in October. And again, exactly the same thing happened in Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq. When the protests happened, the people at the top made immediate concessions. We'll have a new election law, we'll have a new election, a new president. We're going to put some people in jail, get some people, corrupt people on trial. Limited concessions, change the voting age, but no real change in how power is exercised. And that's the real issue.
Thanks, Rami. Appreciate it. Ali, I wanted to ask you about the 250 million that I think it was the World Bank, was it, that allocated to Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago for COVID relief. Are those, I mean, we're short on time, but are those really used, those funds used wisely?
Well, I think there are two things. There's the 246 million for the support, the cash transfer program that the World Bank is helping address the mitigate the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable groups. And then we have the COVID-related support that I think is jointly, if I'm not mistaken, by the World Bank with the WHO. I think expanding the safety net and putting it in place is extremely important. I think there are a lot of concern that at least part of this foreign funding that is coming also, of course, in the form of loan is being channeled to recipient in Lebanese pounds and not at the market rate. So de facto, there's more or less a haircut, but of course it's benefiting the coffers of the Central Bank of Lebanon. So there are a lot of contentious issues when it comes to implementation, but I think in the grand scheme of things, given the short-term need to have resources to support vulnerable groups is extremely important. I think the other concern that relates to the sectarianism and the governance is the ability of managing this in a transparent and based on solid criteria. I think there is a tremendous effort that has been made by the Central Inspection and other institutions, and a program called Impact that is trying to improve the targeting of the program, working with the World Bank and other stakeholders. So there are efforts that are aiming to contain basically the eagerness of the politician to capture, I would say, part of this financing. I hope we will be able to reduce their footprints on and maximize the impact on those that need it the most.
Thanks, Alia. One final question to Mara. This is an email question from Bill Grant. When will this situation become dire enough for people from all sections or sects to decide that the collective good is more important than their own sect's prosperity?
This is not about the people, it's about people in state institutions. We want people in state institutions to be custodians of the common good and to hold people accountable when they don't respect the common good. So it's not, I think the solidarity initiatives we have show that people are aware of the value of collaboration and working together, and people who are trapped in the clientelistic system of sectarian patrons are not happily trapped. They don't have much choices. They have been socialized into this system for a variety of conditions. We're not culturally bound to be sectarian or to be trapped in clientelism. We suffer from a state that has been captured to go back to the key term that Alia used. We suffer from political actors that have extracted public resources of the state and natural resources of the country. And as long as these people are in charge of state institutions, we don't have anybody who's protecting that public good. The public good, by definition, ought to be protected and safeguarded by public servants. We do not have public servants, or very few, to be fair. Very few are struggling in some public institutions. So
yeah,
just to
very few, and we want them to be very many. Thank you very much for that answer. Appreciate it. Thanks for the panelists for being with us today. This has been really illuminating. We appreciate your participation. Thanks to our audience for participating and sending in their questions. We appreciate it very much. The recording of this event will be available by this afternoon or tomorrow. We appreciate your joining us. Join us again on for other events at arabcenter.org and arabcenterwashingtondc.org. We appreciate it again and again. And